darkness, knowledge emerges.
I can still hear them in the distance, even now as I write this by the light of a salvaged lumen strip that flickers with the irregularity of failing power cells. The sound never stops, the guttural roaring, the crashing of crude weapons against makeshift shields, the whooping calls that echo across the ruined landscape like the laughter of mad gods. It has been 347 days since the last evacuation transport lifted off without me, since I watched the grey underbelly of that salvation disappear into clouds thick with ash and spore drift, since I understood with absolute certainty that I would die on this world that had ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. My name is Lector Secundus Varen Holt, and I was an agricultural compliance officer assigned to monitor the tithe quotas of AgriWorld Tertius 9, a planet whose official designation I clung to, even as its reality crumbled into something the Administratum had no forms to properly categorize. We called it the Green Death when we still had enough personnel left to call it anything, when there were still others to speak to, when language seemed like it might matter. The Orcs had always been here, in a way. That was the terrible joke of it all. The Departamento Munitorum files I'd reviewed during transit, dry parchment accounts stamped with authenticity seals, mentioned them as a footnote, a managed threat, feral populations in the equatorial wastes that the planetary defense forces contained through regular culling operations. Sustainable threat parameters, the documentation assured, minimal impact on agricultural production. I remember reading those words in my quarters aboard the transport ship, feeling the particular satisfaction that came from reviewing properly filed reports, from seeing that every variable had been accounted for and documented according to protocol. The Imperium's bureaucracy was the spine that held civilization together, I believed then. If something was properly documented, properly categorized, properly filed in triplicate with the appropriate seals and countersignatures, then it was under control. Reality conformed to paperwork. That was the fundamental faith that sustained us all. I arrived during harvest season, when the endless grain fields stretched golden beneath a sun that seemed too large, too red, casting everything in a light that made the horizon look like it was perpetually burning. The planetary capital, a modest affair by Hive world standards, perhaps 3 million souls squatted at the convergence of 5 major agricultural districts. Its architecture, the standard Imperial Gothic rendered in local stone that had a faint pink quality, almost flesh-like in certain lights. I reported to the Administratum complex on my second day, a building that smelled of old parchment and low-stick smoke, and the particular mustiness that accumulates wherever thousands of documents slowly decompose in inadequate climate control. My superior, Senior Lector Grave, was a woman whose augmetic eyes clicked and whirred as they adjusted focus, who spoke in the clipped efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years reducing agricultural output to numbers that pleased distant authorities who would never see a grain of wheat themselves. The feral population has increased, she told me during my orientation, her voice carrying no more alarm than if she were discussing a fluctuation in rainfall patterns. 17% above projected estimates, according to the most recent aerial surveys. The Planetary Defense Force has been authorized to expand their culling operations. It's being handled. She stamped a form as she said this, the wax seal pressing into parchment with the finality of divine judgment. Handled. The word was supposed to be reassuring. In the Administratum's lexicon, handled meant that appropriate parties had been notified, that resources had been allocated, that someone somewhere had filed the necessary paperwork to ensure the problem was being addressed through proper channels. What it actually meant, I would learn, was that everyone was carefully documenting their lack of culpability while the situation spiraled beyond anyone's capacity to contain it. The smell hit me first when I conducted my initial field inspection of Agricultural District Primus Alpha. It rode the wind that blew across the grain fields, not the clean vegetable scent of growing crops but something underneath it, something that reminded me of the rendering facilities where failed livestock was processed into corpse starch. Decay, but aggressive decay, active rot that seemed to spread through the air itself. My guide, a local overseer named Keltin who'd spent his entire life on Tertius 9, saw me wrinkle my nose and smiled with the grim familiarity of someone sharing an unpleasant truth. "That's them," he said simply, gesturing toward the distant tree line that marked the edge of cultivated land. "The greenskins. When the wind's right, you can smell them from 5 kilometers out. Gets worse every year." We stood on an observation platform overlooking hectares of grain ready for harvest, and I asked the question that any off-worlder asks when confronted with something that seems obviously wrong. Why not push them further back, clear more territory? Keltin's smile faded. "We try. Every season, the PDF goes out with flamers and artillery, burns their settlements, kills as many as they can find, and every season, there's more of them. They grow like fungus, sir. The more you kill, the more spores get released, the more eventually grow back. It's not like fighting humans. You can't break their morale, can't make them retreat. They just keep coming, and they breed faster than we can cull them." He paused, looking out at the grain fields with an expression I couldn't quite read. "My grandfather used to say we don't farm wheat here. We farm in spite of what wants to farm us." The attacks were sporadic in those early days, raids by small groups, a dozen or 2 dozen feral orcs emerging from the forests to smash their way through whatever got in their path before the defense forces drove them back. I witnessed my first raid 43 days into my posting. I was conducting a routine inspection of a grain processing facility when the alarms started, a wailing klaxon that sent workers scattering toward designated shelters, while armed overseers took positions behind reinforced firing slits. The orcs came through the perimeter fence like it wasn't there, crude choppers and clubs in hands that seemed disproportionately large even for their massive bodies. Their skin the color of diseased vegetation, their eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite intelligence, but was unmistakably aware. They roared as they came, a sound that resonated in my chest cavity, that made my hands shake as I crouched behind a cargo container and watched the overseers open fire. Las fire cut through green flesh, leaving smoking wounds that should have been immediately fatal. But the orcs didn't fall like humans did. They staggered, roared louder, and kept coming, sometimes swinging their weapons even as organs that should have been vital spilled from opened torsos. It took concentrated fire to bring each one down, sustained burning until tissue charred, and even their supernatural vitality couldn't keep them moving. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes. 16 orcs killed, 2 overseers dead, 5 workers who hadn't reached shelter in time reduced to pulp by crude weapons that relied on mass and momentum rather than any refinement. I filed my report that evening with hands that still trembled, noting the incident according to proper format, assigning it the correct threat classification, forwarding copies to all appropriate authorities. The violence I had witnessed was horrifying, but it was containable violence. 16 orcs dead. The system had worked. The Imperium's strength had prevailed. The smell grew worse over the following months. That was how you could track the situation degrading, not through official reports or command briefings, but through your nose, through the way the wind carried increasing concentrations of that particular rot stench that meant orc populations were expanding. The PDF's culling operations continued, but with decreasing effectiveness, and I started to notice things in the reports that came across my desk: ammunition expenditure rising, casualty rates increasing, the average size of orc raiding parties growing from dozens to scores to hundreds, and beneath all of it, buried in supplementary documentation that most administrators wouldn't bother reading, estimates of the total feral population that climbed with each quarterly assessment. 17% above projections became 29%, then 42%, then the estimates stopped including percentages and just provided raw numbers that seemed designed to be incomprehensible: millions upon millions of greenskins scattered across the equatorial forests, breeding in the ruins of ancient settlements, growing like the fungal organisms they essentially were. Senior Lector Grave called an administrative council meeting on day 173. I remember the date precisely because it was the day I stopped believing that proper documentation could save us. We gathered in a conference chamber whose walls were lined with maps showing agricultural districts in neat geometric divisions, with population centers marked in red, With defensive installations indicated by appropriate military symbology, everything looked orderly on those maps. Everything looked managed. Graves stood before us, perhaps 30 administrative personnel of various ranks, and spoke in her usual clipped efficiency about declining productivity, about the challenges of maintaining harvest schedules when agricultural workers were being diverted to defensive construction, about the need to adjust our projection models to account for increased threat parameters. She never once said we were losing. She never once acknowledged that the neat geometric divisions on the maps no longer corresponded to reality, that the orcs weren't confined to the equatorial wastes anymore, that their raids were reaching further into cultivated territories with each passing week. I raised my hand. It felt absurd even as I did it, like a child in a schola seeking permission to speak, but the ritual of bureaucratic procedure was all we had left. Senior Lector, what is the contingency plan if the threat parameters exceed our capacity to manage them? The chamber went quiet. Graves' augmetic eyes focused on me with unsettling precision, clicking through focus adjustments that seemed to last forever. Then she smiled, a thin expression that conveyed no warmth whatsoever. Lector Secundus Holt, the administratum does not operate on contingency plans. We operate on documentation. Our function is to record, to report, to ensure that all information flows through proper channels to those authorities empowered to make strategic decisions. If you are asking whether I believe we face an existential threat, the answer is that such assessments are outside our purview. We document. Others decide. That is the system. She turned back to the maps, effectively dismissing my question, and continued her presentation about adjusted quota expectations. The evacuation order came on day 209, though order implies a level of organization that never materialized. What actually happened was that a single transport ship, an aged cargo hauler called the Harvest Providence, arrived in orbit with instructions to extract essential personnel and critical documentation before departing for the System's outer relay station. Essential personnel. The phrase triggered immediate chaos as everyone with any administrative authority began arguing about who qualified, about what essential meant, about who had the proper credentials to board and who would be left behind. I was in my quarters when the riots started, when agricultural workers who'd heard about the evacuation ship stormed the administratum complex, demanding to be included on the manifest, when the PDF units guarding the building opened fire on civilians they'd been protecting days before, when the screaming started and didn't stop. I made it to the spaceport through back routes, carrying nothing but my data slate and the clothes I wore, following crowds of panicking civilians who'd had the same desperate idea. The spaceport was bedlam, thousands of people surging against chain-link fences, scrambling over cargo containers, rushing the landing pad where the Harvest Providence sat like a grey promise of salvation. The ship could hold perhaps 500 passengers in its cargo holds if they packed in tight. There were tens of thousands trying to board. I pushed through the crowd, my administratum credentials clutched in one hand, screaming my designation and rank at anyone who would listen. A PDF sergeant at one of the gates actually looked at my papers, actually seemed to be considering whether to let me through, when the first mortar round hit somewhere behind us, an orc weapon, crude but effective, lobbing explosive shells into the densest parts of the crowd. The explosion knocked me down, and when I pulled myself up, my ears ringing, blood running from somewhere on my scalp, I saw the sergeant was gone. The gate was open. People were trampling each other to get through, a human avalanche of desperation that swept me along whether I wanted to go or not. I lost my data slate somewhere in that crush, lost my credentials, nearly lost consciousness when an elbow caught me in the temple. But I stayed on my feet through pure animal panic, letting the crowd carry me forward until I was somehow at the base of the Harvest Providence's loading ramp, looking up at the ship's crew who were trying to manage the boarding with shock mauls and shouted orders that no one could hear over the screaming. I was 10 meters from the ramp when the orcs hit the spaceport perimeter. Not a raiding party, a horde, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, erupting from the streets beyond the fence line with that roaring that made my teeth ache. The PDF units that were supposed to be holding them back were either dead or had abandoned their positions. The orcs poured through gaps in the defenses like floodwater, finding every crack, their crude weapons rising and falling in butcher's work, their massive forms silhouetted against fires that were consuming the city beyond. The crowd panicked, surging in every direction at once, and I was knocked down, trampled, kicked in the ribs and face by people who didn't even see me as human anymore, just as an obstacle between them and the ship. When I finally got my head up, gasping for air that tasted like blood and smoke and that terrible orc smell, the Harvest Providence was lifting off. Not a measured departure, a panicked launch, its engines screaming, its loading ramp still partially extended with people clinging to it who would fall to their deaths seconds later. I watched it climb through the smoke, watched it disappear into clouds that churned with spore drift, watched my salvation vanish, and knew with absolute certainty that I had been abandoned. Around me, the orcs were among the crowd now, and the killing had the efficiency of harvesters working through wheat. I ran. I don't remember the direction or the route, just the running, just the burning in my lungs, and the conviction that every second I kept moving was another second I stayed alive. I found shelter in a grain silo on the outskirts of agricultural district Secundus Beta, a massive cylindrical structure that still held perhaps 1,000 tons of wheat awaiting transport that would never come. The entrance was a maintenance hatch barely large enough to squeeze through, and once inside, I climbed the access ladder into darkness that smelled of grain, dust, and rust, climbing until my arms gave out, and I collapsed on a catwalk somewhere in the structure's upper reaches. I stayed there for 3 days, surviving on handfuls of raw wheat and water from a condensation pipe, listening to the sounds of the city dying in the distance, the orc roaring, the screams, the collapse of buildings, the eventual silence that was somehow worse than the noise. When I finally emerged, the planetary capital was gone. Not destroyed in the sense of rubble and ruins, consumed in the sense that it had been physically taken apart, every useful component scavenged, every structure reduced to raw materials that the orcs could repurpose. I walked through streets I'd traveled daily for months and recognized nothing. The Administratum complex where I'd spent my working hours was just a foundation now, every stone carried away, leaving only rectangular patches of discolored earth where walls had stood. The hab blocks where thousands had lived were skeletal frameworks stripped of everything that could be removed. And everywhere, evidence of the orcs, their crude glyph marks painted on surfaces, their scrap constructions rising from cleared spaces, their dung and refuse carpeting the ground with a layer of filth that squelched underfoot. I survived the next months through caution and luck in equal measure, learning the patterns of orc behavior through observation, understanding that they were most active during daylight hours, that they ranged in packs but sometimes individuals would separate from the group, that they were attracted to noise and movement but had poor attention spans, easily distracted by anything that seemed more interesting than their current focus. I scavenged food from abandoned agricultural stores, finding caches of preserved rations that the orcs hadn't discovered or hadn't wanted, supplementing it with what grain I could harvest from unharvested fields that were slowly being reclaimed by whatever native vegetation had preceded human cultivation. Water was easier. The planet's network of irrigation canals still functioned in many places, and I learned to treat it with purification tablets I'd found in a ruined Medicae facility. The isolation was harder than the hunger. Humans are not meant to exist in complete solitude, cut off from language and social interaction, reduced to the status of prey animal hiding from predators. I started talking to myself, having full conversations, creating imaginary colleagues who would respond in ways I desperately needed to hear. This is a temporary situation, I would tell them in my hiding places, in the ruins of agricultural facilities where I'd shelter during orc migrations. The Imperium will return. They'll send a fleet, reclaim this world, restore proper order. We just have to survive until then. The imaginary colleagues would agree enthusiastically, would assure me that my reasoning was sound, that rescue was inevitable. But their voices got weaker over time, less convincing, until eventually I stopped bothering to imagine their responses and just spoke my desperate hopes into empty air that carried them nowhere. I saw other survivors occasionally in those months, glimpses of human figures moving through ruins, trying to stay hidden just as I was. A few times I almost approached them, almost risked exposure to rejoin some fragment of human community. But each time I hesitated too long, paralyzed by fear that they might be hostile, that desperation might have reduced them to something that would see me as a resource to exploit rather than a fellow sufferer. And each time, the orcs found them before I could make a decision. I would watch from hiding as the greenskins descended on whatever shelter the survivors had constructed, would see the brief struggle, would hear the screaming cut short, would watch the orcs haul away bodies for purposes I tried very hard not to imagine. After the third time this happened, I stopped looking for other survivors. The human instinct for community had become a death sentence. The orcs changed over those months, or perhaps I just started noticing things I'd missed before. They weren't a unified force, but something more like competing tribes, differentiated by the crude glyphs they painted on themselves and their equipment, by the slight variations in their weaponry and dress. Some carried choppers, made from farming equipment, scythes and threshing blades repurposed into crude swords. Others had guns of a sort, massive crude firearms that looked like they might explode when fired, but somehow functioned well enough to be lethal. The larger orcs, the ones I learned to identify as leaders through their more elaborate ornamentation and the deference shown by smaller greenskins, wore armor cobbled together from salvaged materials, plasteel panels from hab blocks, sections of PDF vehicles, sometimes entire sheets of corrugated metal just strapped to their torsos with wire and rope. They fought among themselves as often as they did anything else. I witnessed battles between rival mobs that were utterly without restraint or strategy, just massive brawls where greenskins hacked at each other with the same enthusiasm they'd shown killing humans. The victors would loot the dead, taking weapons and armor, and sometimes physically carrying away corpses for reasons I didn't want to think about. But they didn't seem to resent these conflicts. If anything, they appeared to enjoy them, roaring with what sounded like laughter as they split each other's skulls, pausing sometimes to bellow appreciation at particularly impressive acts of violence. War wasn't something inflicted on them. War was their natural state, the environment they flourished in, the purpose for which they existed. I found the burned-out Chimera transport on day 270, half buried in what had been a defensive trench line on the agricultural district's outer perimeter. The PDF unit that had crewed it was long dead, reduced to scattered bones and scraps of uniform, but the vehicle itself was mostly intact beneath scoring from orc weapons and whatever fire had gutted its interior. I spent 2 days carefully excavating it, working only at night, removing enough dirt that I could access the rear compartment. Inside, beneath seats that had burned down to metal frames, I found what I'd been hoping for: a Vox unit, military grade, damaged but not destroyed, wrapped in protective casing that had saved it from the worst of the fire. Getting it operational took another week of scavenging components, of learning by trial and error how Imperial military communications equipment functioned, of risking exposure every time I had to search ruins for parts I needed. But eventually, finally, I managed to generate a carrier signal to send out a distress call on every frequency I could access. This is Lector Secundus Varen Holt of the Administratum, broadcasting from Agri-World Tertius 9. The planet has fallen to Xenos forces. Unknown number of Imperial citizens may still survive. Requesting immediate extraction and relief forces. Please respond. I broadcast that message on loop, letting it run while I hid nearby, hoping that somewhere in the system, some ship or relay station or orbital facility might pick up my signal and respond. The response came on the third day. Not the Imperial Navy or a rescue fleet, but a single burst of text-only transmission that appeared on the Vox unit's cracked display screen. Tertius 9, designated lost to Xenos infestation. Quarantine protocols active. No relief operations authorized. Recommend immediate self-termination to prevent capture. The Emperor protects. That was all. No signature, no follow-up, just a bureaucratic notification that I had been written off, that Tertius 9 was now simply a red mark on some strategist's chart, a world to be avoided, possibly to be subjected to exterminatus if the orc infestation threatened to spread beyond the system. I sat in front of that Vox unit for hours, rereading that message, feeling something fundamental break inside me that I didn't have words to describe. Not hope. Hope was a luxury I'd lost months ago. But purpose, maybe. The conviction that surviving mattered, that bearing witness had value, that clinging to life was anything more than animal instinct refusing to acknowledge its own irrelevance. I destroyed the Vox unit after that, smashed it with a rock until it was just fragments and circuitry scattered across the floor of the Chimera's burned compartment. Then, I walked back to my current hiding place, a collapsed grain storage bunker where I'd hollowed out a space beneath twisted metal sheeting, and tried to decide whether the Imperium's advice about self-termination was sound. I had a las pistol I'd scavenged from a dead enforcer, its power cell depleted but enough charge left for a single shot. I held it against my temple multiple times that night, felt the cold metal warming from contact with my skin, tried to find the conviction to pull the trigger. But I couldn't. Some fundamental programming wouldn't allow it, some deeply instilled prohibition against self-destruction that the Imperium's conditioning had embedded so thoroughly I couldn't override it, even when logic said I should. The Orc warlord appeared sometime around day 300. I didn't witness his arrival no single moment when he materialized, but suddenly there was a presence in the Orc populations, a figure that the various mobs seemed to acknowledge as superior. He was massive even by Orc standards, perhaps 3 meters tall, his body a collection of scars and crude augmetics, and muscle that looked dense enough to stop bullets through sheer mass. He wore armor that was actually coherent, rather than just scavenged junk plates that fit together with something approaching intentional design, covered in glyphs that might have been kill marks or might have been Orc writing. I had no way to tell. And he carried weapons that looked functional, even sophisticated in their brutality, a massive cleaver that gleamed like it was maintained, a pistol that seemed too large for human hands but that he wielded with casual ease. His presence changed the Orcs. The scattered mobs started to coalesce, to move with more coordination, to engage in activities that looked almost like planning. They began constructing structures that served clear purposes, fortifications around what had been the planetary capital, crude workshops where they hammered scavenged metal into new weapons and armor, gathering places where hundreds would assemble to roar and beat their weapons against shields in displays that might have been religious fervor or might have been their equivalent of entertainment. The warlord would appear at these gatherings, would bellow in their guttural language, would gesture with weapons toward horizons, and the assembled Orcs would roar their approval in voices that made the ground vibrate. I understood what was happening with sick certainty. The feral populations were organizing, the warlord was unifying them, transforming them from scattered tribes into something that approached an army, and I knew, with the clarity that comes from months of observation, what would come next. They would expand beyond Tertius 9, would construct crude spacecraft from salvaged materials. Orcs could do that. I'd learned from old military briefings I'd reviewed years ago, could somehow make technology function through sheer belief and violent pragmatism, would carry their spores to other worlds, would become a warg that the Imperium would have to mobilize fleets to contain. All because a routine agricultural world's feral population had exceeded manageable parameters, and no one had bothered to act until it was too late. The sound is what I remember most clearly from those final weeks before I accepted that I would never leave this world. The constant roaring of hundreds of thousands of Orcs gathering, organizing, preparing for whatever campaign the warlord was planning. It would start as a low rumble at the horizon, would build throughout the day as more mobs arrived from distant territories, would peak during evening hours when the warlord conducted his gatherings, would fade somewhat during night but never entirely cease. The planet itself seemed to vibrate with their presence, as if the very ground was resonating in sympathy with their violence, and beneath it carried on winds that never fully cleared, that smell rot and fungal growth and something that resembled burnt meat, the olfactory signature of a species that existed to consume and destroy. I'm writing this now, in what was once a Medicae facility's basement, a space the Orcs haven't discovered because it's buried beneath rubble they haven't bothered to clear. My lumen strip is dying, and I have no replacement. My food supplies will last perhaps another week. The rainy season is approaching, and I can hear water beginning to seep through cracks in the ceiling, pooling on the floor in spreading puddles that reflect the failing light. I have covered myself in mud and filth to mask my human smell, have learned to move with orc-like gait when I must travel during daylight, have reduced myself to something that survives through mimicry of the monsters that hunt it. But I am still alive, still conscious, Still able to record this testimony in handwriting that grows increasingly erratic as my hands shake from protein deficiency and accumulated stress. I don't know who will read this, perhaps no one. Perhaps the Imperium will eventually return to Tertius 9, will purge it with virus bombs or lance strikes from orbit, will reduce it to a lifeless ball of rock where nothing remains to suggest humans once tried to civilize it. Perhaps some future expedition will sift through ruins and find these pages, will puzzle over handwriting that documents the final days of a world that should have been saved but wasn't, that fell not to dramatic invasion but to bureaucratic failure and institutional paralysis. Perhaps the orcs will find this hiding place tomorrow, and my testimony will end mid-sentence, cut short by violence that doesn't even register my existence as significant enough to remember. But I keep writing because it's all I have left. The Administratum trained me to document, to record, to ensure that information persists even when those who generated it do not. So I document, I record. I testify to the failure of systems that were supposed to be eternal, to the collapse of order that was supposed to be absolute, to the reality that the Imperium's strength is more fragile than its propaganda admits. Tertius 9 fell not because the orcs were unstoppable, but because stopping them required someone with authority to make difficult decisions, to accept short-term costs for long-term security, to prioritize military action over agricultural quotas. And no one did. Everyone passed the problem up the chain until it became too large for any response short of planetary annihilation. The orcs are gathering again. I can hear them through the rubble above me, their roaring building toward another one of the warlords' assemblies. Soon they will march, will carry their war to other worlds, will spread like the spores that made them across territories that contain billions of humans who don't know they're already marked for consumption. And I will remain here, in this flooded basement that smells of mold and human waste and despair, surviving for a few more days or weeks until starvation or disease or simple accident ends me. I am trapped on a world overrun by feral orcs, and there is no escape, no rescue, no hope of anything except the gradual degradation of body and mind until what remains is barely recognizable as human. The lumen strip just flickered. It will die soon, and I will be in darkness, complete darkness, with only the sound of water dripping and orcs roaring and my own breathing to mark the passage of time. I have tried to imagine what my colleagues in the Administratum would document about my end. Lector Secundus Varon Holt, lost in the course of duty, his service noted and filed in appropriate records. A single line in some archive that no one will ever read. A footnote to a disaster that consumed millions. But even that seems like too much dignity for what is actually happening. The truth is simpler, more terrible. I am being erased. My existence is becoming meaningless. And soon there will be nothing left to prove I was ever here except these pages, which themselves will rot and fade and become unreadable, just more debris in the ruins of a failed world. The sound continues. Always the sound. The roaring that never stops, that has become the texture of existence, that will be the last thing I hear before I die. I can taste it in the air now, their presence, their smell, their violence transmuted into sensory information that coats the inside of my mouth like ash. My hands are shaking too badly to write clearly anymore. The pages are damp from seeping water, the ink already beginning to blur. Soon I will put down this stylus and curl up in the driest corner I can find and try to sleep, knowing that each sleep might be the last, that I might not wake, that my body might simply give out from accumulated strain and deprivation. But not yet. Not quite yet. As long as I can move my hand, as long as the lumen strip provides enough light to see, I will continue. I will document. I will testify. I will fulfill my function as an agent of the Administratum. Even though the Administratum abandoned me, even though no one will ever file these reports, even though the information I preserve will decay into illegibility before anyone reads it, because this is what I am. This is what they made me. A recorder of events, a documenter of failure, a witness to the end of worlds who persists in his function, even when that function has lost all meaning. The roaring grows louder. They must be close now, perhaps directly above me, gathered in the ruins that were once streets where I walked in sunshine and believed that civilization was eternal. I can feel the vibration through the floor, through the walls, through my bones, the weight of their presence, the physical reality of a species that exists to destroy. And I understand, finally, what it means to be truly trapped. Not confined by walls or chains or physical restraint, but by the impossibility of escape, by the absolute certainty that there is nowhere to run and nothing to run to, that the world itself has become a cage from which death is the only exit. The lumen strip is failing. The light flickers, dims, brightens briefly, then dims again to almost nothing. I can barely see the page now. My handwriting must be wandering across lines I can no longer distinguish. But I continue, because stopping means accepting that I am already dead, that the person who began this document no longer exists, and what remains is just biological processes running down toward their inevitable conclusion. I continue because the alternative is to sit in darkness and wait for the end, and that seems like more defeat than I can bear. They are coming. I hear movement in the rubble above, hear the scrape of metal on stone as they dig toward something, possibly this basement, possibly just clearing debris for their own purposes. My heart is racing, adrenaline flooding my system in preparation for flight or fight, even though neither option exists. I should be afraid. I should be terrified. But what I actually feel is something closer to relief. The waiting will end soon. The uncertainty will resolve. And whatever happens next, it will at least be different from this endless suspension between survival and death. The lumen strip dies, complete darkness now. I can't see the page, can't see my hand, can't see anything except the faint light filtering through cracks in the ceiling far above, light that flickers with the passage of massive shapes. I'm writing blind, the stylus moving across paper I can't see, recording words that may not even be forming coherently anymore. But I continue, because this is what I am, this is what I do. I document, I record, I testify, even in darkness, even alone, even when every rational analysis says it's meaningless. I fulfill my function until biology prevents it, and then I stop. The sound of them digging grows louder, closer. They will reach me soon, minutes, perhaps, maybe less. And then this testimony ends. Then the last human voice on Tertius 9 goes silent. Then the orcs inherit everything, and there is nothing left but them and their violence and their roaring that drowns out memory of every human who died here. But until then, until that final moment, I write. I document. I testify to the horror of being trapped on a world overrun by feral orcs, to the failure of systems that should have prevented this, to the abandonment of millions who believed the Imperium would protect them. The stylus is almost out of ink. I can feel it scratching dry across paper, leaving marks that might not even be visible if light returns. My hand is cramping, fingers locked around the stylus in a grip I'm not sure I could release if I wanted to. The sound above me is deafening now. They're right there, just above, tearing through rubble that separates me from them by perhaps a meter of broken stone and metal. This is the end. This is where it concludes. And my last thought, my final testimony, is this. We failed. The Imperium failed. Humanity failed. Not through weakness or cowardice, but through the same bureaucratic paralysis that has always been our greatest vulnerability. We documented the problem. We filed reports. We followed proper channels. And while we waited for someone with authority to act, the orcs multiplied and organized and conquered, and now they will spread from this world to others, and the pattern will repeat, because the systems designed to prevent this are fundamentally broken. I hear them breaking through, hear stone falling, see light, real light, daylight spilling through a gap in the ceiling as their crude tools tear away the barrier, and I understand that I will not finish this sentence, that my testimony ends here, incomplete, fragmentary, just another piece of documentation that will never be properly filed because the filing system no longer exists, and I,